while the sharing economy and the robot revolution has gotten a lot of attention and made a lot of headlines, policymakers across the country are thinking about this idea of how do we grapple with the intersection of technology and employment and work in a digital economy. We have a great slate of panelists, and I'll let Annette go ahead and introduce them. But first, I do want to introduce Annette, our moderator for the first panel. Annette Meeks is the founder and CEO of the Freedom Foundation of Minnesota. And she's been a leader in both state and federal policy reform for a number of years and has held high-profile positions in both government and nonprofit research organizations. And I think she's the perfect person to be leading this discussion today about what's happening across the country in the intersection of technology and employment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Annette and our first panel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay then. My name is Annette Meeks, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all today, and I'm really thrilled to talk about this topic. I was talking to one of my board members on Friday about coming out here and this opportunity, and he's like, the future of work, wow, that's fabulous. He's kind of a techie guy, and we got to talking about it, and he said, so what are you talking about? Went through the agenda, and he's like, no, I mean the future of work. And I said, well, yes, that's the first panel that I'm moderating. It's like, first panel, that's not all day? I said, yes, we could take all day. It's that amazing of a topic. Probably for the next 20 years, it's going to be that kind of topic. And it's one of those things where we're met with both fear and trepidation and then avoidance. And we're here to talk about why all of those shouldn't be your state government policies, and more importantly, why we need to help talk about this as state-based leaders, and also to usher in this new generation of work that's coming, whether we're prepared for it or not. You know, there's lots of questions surrounding the future of work, and I'm just going to go through 3 or 4 very briefly and get on with the panel. And specifically, the biggest question, of course, we hear from a state-based level is, will we have enough work? What's going to happen to all of these displaced workers? We hear talk about the gig economy. We have folks who worry about, will technology further exacerbate income inequality? What about automation? What's that going to do to a whole host of jobs? And will it create more jobs? Or frankly, in states like ours, a manufacturing and agricultural-based state, will it take away so many jobs that we're faced with massive unemployment in certain sectors of our economy? So what is the future of work, and what should we be doing as laboratories of democracy? That's what we're here to talk about, and we have some really smart people who know a lot more about this than I do. We're going to take some questions from the audience right after they're done with some brief presentations, and then we welcome you to give us your thoughts on this. By the way, the one reason why this is so important is the politics behind this override everything else. We have some governors and other state leaders that have really taken this issue and said, we've got to run with this. And then we have other governors and other state leaders that frankly are so busy focusing on the problems at hand, they don't have time to ponder big issues like this. That's our job, and we're here to help usher that in. So with that, I'd like to start with, I'm going to introduce everyone, and then they're just going to go ahead right down the row and do their presentation, starting with Aaron Hedlund, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Missouri and a visiting fellow at Utah State University. He's also a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, yay cards. He teaches macroeconomics at both the undergrad and PhD levels. In addition to appearing in peer review academic journals, his work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, National Review. He's been used as an expert testifier in state-based think tanks and is presented at numerous think tanks, academic institutions, and central banks around the world. Next up will be Tim Blute. He serves as director of the NGA, the National Governors Association Future Office, where he assists and advises governors and state officials on how emerging technologies will impact governor and state economies, including identifying the opportunity and challenges associated with ongoing technological innovation. Blute holds a JD from American University, Washington College of Law, and a bachelor's degree in international affairs from the George Washington University. Next up, Sam Hammond is Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center. He previously worked as an economist for the Government of Canada, specializing in rural economic development, and as a graduate research fellow at Mercatus. His research focuses on the effectiveness of cash transfers in alleviating poverty and how free markets can be complemented by robust systems of social insurance. And last up, his mother told me to say he should have been first, is Greg Ferenstein, a researcher based in San Francisco, where he focuses on the intersection of politics, economic policy, and Silicon Valley. His work has been seen in the New York Times, Washington Post, the BBC, Reuters, and others. In his free time, he practices, and you got to ask him about this, acrobatic martial arts. There you go. Welcome, panel, and we'll kick it off with Aaron.
All right, is this on? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. This is indeed, we're talking to the big mic. All right, big mic time. All right, so I feel like I should preface this by saying the reality is we don't know what the future of work is going to look like. You know, we all up here run the risk of saying something that 30 years from now we're going to look back and say, wow, that was a disastrous prediction. On the one hand, there's a lot of people who are very excited about what the future of work may look like. A labor market where people aren't constrained to be with one particular employer, but can go from opportunity to opportunity and have a very flexible lifestyle. On the other hand, there are scarier visions of the future of work. I'm forgetting the name of the person to attribute the quote to, but there was a quote made that basically said, future employers will have two employees, a man and a dog. The man will feed the dog, and the dog will prevent the man from touching the machines. So the reality is we don't know. But what we can start with is to talk about what the current state of work is. And the current state of work is very different than it was 30 years ago. So let me focus on a handful of trends, and then to discuss potential policy implications of that. So first of all, the returns to skill, particularly cognitive skill, are higher than they've ever been before. And this is certainly an imperfect measurement of it, but that includes the average return to education. At the same time, the average cost of education has gone up dramatically over the past few decades and doesn't show any obvious signs of slowing down. Further complicating matters is not only is the cost going up, but the uncertainty about the return is going up. So it's true that on average it's high, it's not a guarantee. And given that people are expecting on average that the return to college is going up, there's going to be demand to go, right? That's why you hear about rising student loan debt. Again, that trend is likely to keep going as long as people think that that is the gateway to labor market opportunity. But when you combine more debt with greater uncertainty and greater earnings risk, which is borne out in a number of sources of data, then you're inevitably going to end up with a segment of the population at any point in time that is either in default or has their choices ahead of them in some way constrained by their financial position. So for example, there's quite a bit of research now that's finding out that high student loan debt constrains people's ability to engage in entrepreneurial activities. It affects which jobs they take. So for example, if you're thinking about jobs when you're entering the labor market, on the one hand, you can go for a job that has a higher starting pay, but potentially a lower gradient over time. Or there might be an opportunity that you know up front you're not going to be getting as much pay, but the steep slope is something that would be very attractive. Well, if you've got a lot of student loan debt, that may prevent you from taking that latter opportunity. So we've got higher returns to skill, higher cost to skill, higher uncertainty of skill. All these things are driving and also being fueled by the ability to take on more credit. And to go back to this image that people have, right? One of the visions for the future of work is this idea of basically greater fluidity, right? People aren't at their employer for 30 years anymore, and that's true. But it turns out that the current state of work doesn't really support the idea that the labor market is more fluid. In fact, if anything, the labor market is less fluid. It's true that people may not be spending 30 years at an employer anymore, but the transition rate from job to job is actually falling. So that's actually a concern because there's another trend in the labor market, which is basically greater positive assortative matching, as we say in the research world. It's more and more the case now that higher ability workers are matching with higher productivity firms. There's not as much blending, so to speak. And this has all sorts of implications for risk and opportunities to move up the ladder. So what are some of the challenges these forces present to us? Well, number one is, as it's been pointed out in a number of sources, educational attainment is actually stagnating. So despite the fact that the return is still on average very high, fewer people, the trend of people actually enrolling and completing it is slowing down. And that's particularly true among men. And then for people who do it, they take on a lot of debt, which comes to the second challenge, which is not only is educational attainment stagnating, but the ability to translate that educational attainment to achieving gains in the labor market is being limited by things like debt, other restrictions that are artificial, such as occupational licensing things, and also other dimensions of credit, such as default, if you have a history of default that impacts labor market opportunities and things like that. And one thing that I think is really critical to mention here is this fact that earnings risk is higher. That is intimately tied up with the issue of inequality. And inequality is such a sensitive issue politically, right? Because you've got the left end of the political spectrum who views it as an inherent evil and we need to do all these sorts of things to stop it. And I would say on average, on the right end of the spectrum, there's just a lot of discomfort even saying the word. Right? So what happens is you've got a political debate that is very lopsided. And my point isn't to jump into that, but to simply point out that inequality is intimately tied up with risk. So even if you, whatever your predisposition is, don't have a particular opinion on inequality, I think we all care about risk and instability. So how we design our policies to mitigate that or to think about it is really important. And what that implies is that the public, despite whatever attempts to persuade them of one way or the other, they're going to have a demand for some kind of security. And that could be provided via the regulatory route with hidden taxes, or it can be provided through the safety net route with explicit taxes. And I would say that by and large, most of the economic research indicates that if you're going to try to intervene in one way or the other, we can have debate about how much to intervene, but if you're going to choose a route to intervene, it's generally more economically efficient to go with the explicit visible taxes and the safety net stuff. So these are just a number of things to talk about. We'll discuss this. Of course, all these things are complicated by the realities of budgeting, right? It's easy to make a theoretical argument for why it'd be better to shift from regulations and hidden taxes to explicit taxes and a safety net, but then some politician has to make the argument for actually raising taxes, whereas regulations, they can kind of ignore that. So we'll talk about a number of these issues, and the last thing I want to close with for right now is that something that really needs a lot of attention is this notion of mismatch, right? It is very common to be focusing on things like total job creation, the unemployment rate, but what's crucial is that the right matches be formed between employees and employers. And this is something that impacts individuals, but also impacts the overall economy, because it turns out that this mismatch can have long-term consequences. If people end up, due to extenuating circumstances, being forced in some sense into jobs that aren't the best fit, that's something that can really slow down economic growth. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Tim?
All right. Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. For those of you who don't know, I'm here representing the National Governors Association. That's the nonpartisan voice of America's governors. We're based in Washington, D.C., but the bulk of our work is out here in the states, advising governors on a whole host of policy issues, and we're essentially acting as a consultancy for the nation's governors. So that's the lens through which I view this topic. And I think it's such an important conversation that I would argue we're really past due to have. The labor market has been changing. Technology is exacerbating that in some places. And there are some trends that governors are really concerned about. Aaron made a mention of mismatch. That's one of the top issues we hear about around the current work. And that's one of the challenges that Annette alluded to that our governors are really struggling with. How do I have or begin to think about sort of a future of work conversation with all the question marks, with all of the we just don't know, when I'm also dealing with some actual current workforce challenges that I'm facing in my state. So that's one of the areas where I think we've focused a lot of our efforts in the last couple of years, and governors have had a lot of their concerns and have had a lot of questions that we've tried to help them with. So how do we give them the space to lead on this topic? And how do we say to governors that you need to think about, especially if you're coming in 2019, you got to start to think about all of these emerging in some states, way past emerging in other states, issues around the gig economy, around the broader 1099 economy, around automation, when at the same time, they're hearing from companies in their states that they have immediate today workforce challenges. So we try and have both those conversations with the governors at the same time. The governors that are or have the space to be more forward-leaning, we try and give them the policy advice, put them in contact with the experts, try and, especially on the real deep future of work, try and give them the full broad range of opinions. I think it's sort of not helpful to say to them that every job that can be will be automated, or, hey, it's never going to happen, that's never going to be sort of the future you have to worry about. So on the current workforce challenge, the number one issue we hear about is the mismatch that Aaron talked about, where whether it's because of the nature of the economy in their state and the educational system, the graduates who are coming out aren't prepared for the jobs that that state has, which means that in some cases those graduates are then leaving. That's a constant concern we hear from governors. I'm losing my top graduates. They're leaving this state school and now they're going out to California or to Chicago or New York or Austin to work in the tech economy. We also hear it in the manufacturing sector, and it's closely correlated to America's opioid crisis, where governors are hearing from their companies, I cannot actually find qualified workers because we have such a pervasive opioid crisis right now. I cannot find workers who can pass a drug test. So I use those two sort of examples as a way of saying these are some of the immediate challenges that the governors are trying to grapple with right now as the leaders of their economy. How do I ensure that the economy is growing in a way that means that all citizens have access to good jobs and that we are developing an economy that makes sense given the resources that we have in our state? So what are they doing around that? We've seen some movement in a couple areas. One, a huge interest nationwide on apprenticeships and trying to change the narrative around apprenticeships, that these are not sort of what people may have in their mind as early 20th century trades jobs, that you are apprenticed to become a plumber or an electrician, and then you go into that there are apprenticeships in all sorts of industries. This happened in a number of places around some of the cybersecurity workforce shortages. That's where a lot of the conversation, the tech side of things came up. If we need system security experts, there's no reason that they can't come in under an apprenticeship model, pursue certifications and education, and have that as a pathway to jobs. So you see a number of the governors talking about how do I expand apprenticeships, and a lot of that comes down to just changing the dialogue, explaining to companies that this is not just something for the trades, this makes sense for a number of different industries. The second, a lot of governors paying a lot of close attention to how do they leverage their community college system. How do we make sure that for the jobs that are available, people are attaining the necessary educational requirements or national education certifications, but aren't necessarily pursuing a 4-year degree or a 4-year and then a master's degree if the jobs that are available can be filled and there's a career path through the community college system. The third piece is aligning education with the private sector. We hear this concern from a number of the states where how do we make sure we're having a conversation so that the universities and the community colleges for that matter are graduating students that have the skills that are in demand. Too often we hear from companies and governors hear from companies that they're just getting students who don't have the skills that they need right now, and that adds to that mismatch. The last two pieces I want to touch on. One is occupational licensing. The governors have done a number of governors have had work in this space, really taking a look at the occupational licensing regimes in their state to make sure that they're not leaving, qualified citizens are not unable to get into jobs because of burdensome licensing regulations. We had a project on this a number of years ago around veterans in particular, and thinking about how can we make sure that veterans who come out of the military with these incredible skill sets aren't somehow being boxed out of jobs that in some cases they may have a decade's worth of training with because they don't meet licensing regulations. And then the last piece, and this one I know is a lot tougher for governors to crack, but is around how do we create this culture of lifelong learning? So how do we have a conversation with folks who are in college, say, or in high school today, and say, it's unlikely that you're going to go out, graduate high school, graduate college, go into your job, be there for 30 years, and never have to pivot, never have to change, never have to go back to school, never have to get another certification. And how do we lead on that topic? And how do we tell people, you're going to spend a lot of money on education, but it doesn't end there. Just because you have that 4-year degree doesn't mean it can change. And I think what the governors are attempting to do and attempting to lead on is the combination of lifelong learning with a culture of entrepreneurship. Those may be two of the better hedges against the uncertainty of the future of work. So regardless of whether we're looking at sort of the high-end estimates of half the jobs being automated or you believe that none of them are going to be, our opinion and the governor's opinion is that there's no downside to trying to create entrepreneurial ecosystems with lifelong learners. And then the last piece I want to touch on is just the question we get from a lot of the governors is, how do I lead on this topic? You know, citizens are uncertain about the future. They're concerned about what the future security of a job is, what is the value of the education I'm receiving. So how do we lead on this? If we don't know where we're going, if economists are in disagreement about where the economy is going, if the technology community is in disagreement, can you give us the power to lead on this? So that's what a lot of our focus is trying to make sure that they can stand up and try and reassure their citizens about where things are going when we don't know where they're going. So trying to give them some of these baseline things that they can start with to try and build their robust economies. So.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sam?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm going to structure my remarks sort of from the federal to the local. And I got into this topic sort of looking at the experience in the early 2000s where with China entering the World Trade Organization, you had this major shock that led to, by some estimates, 2 million lost manufacturing jobs. And the remarkable thing about that is when you break down on a census tract by census tract basis how our systems of social insurance responded to that phenomena, Social Security disability and retirement were something like 11 times more responsive than unemployment insurance. So what does that mean? It means that the systems we have in place, especially in vulnerable states that sometimes have smaller tax bases and have worse funded local programs, instead of falling into an unemployment program that kept them afloat for a few months and put them through retraining and tried to match them through job banks, the path of least resistance was to either exit the labor force altogether or to go on disability. And you're seeing now with the strong recovery, the number of people who are finally exiting disability insurance, suggesting that these people aren't truly out of the labor force. They are sort of wanting a more responsive, flexible system of social insurance. And so this is where my sort of thought bubble came from in a paper I wrote recently, The Free Market Welfare State, talking about how states and the federal government can coordinate to construct systems of social insurance that both meet the needs of economic security that people feel, but do it in a way that is compatible or even complementary to mobility and market flexibility. So, it's easier to sometimes identify what not to do in this case. So, unemployment insurance systems have eroded dramatically in many states, partly because of falling payroll tax revenues. And so if I'm breaking this down on a federal state sort of responsibility, I think there is a real need for some kind of dedicated federal funding stream, particularly for reemployment programs. Now the problem is GAO did a study of this a few years back, and there's something like already 60-some employment training programs scattered throughout the federal government. So in terms of a federal initiative, consolidating a lot of those, simplifying it, making it a simple funding stream that states can use to structure and design for programs that fit their local needs, I think would be a really useful initiative, in part because the places that are going to be most hit by any kind of future automation are also going to be places that have fissured tax bases and difficulty self-funding a lot of this stuff. The next, so going to what not to do, there's a recent study, or a recent New York Times article about workers at Marriott. And so Marriott in China has begun rolling out this Alexa program that is replacing their front desk workers and their concierge. And within a few years, anytime you go to a Marriott in China, you'll not have to interact with anybody. You just say, "Hi Alexa, check me in." And they're beginning to roll that out now in America. They're piloting it in a few places. And in response, the New York Times had this big write-up. There's dozens of locations that have voted to unionize, in part because they're seeing this coming down the track. And to me, there are cases where unions make sense, where it comes in terms of having worker voices be heard. But if it's simply about job protection, I think this is the exact wrong route to go. And I think it's going to be a bigger and bigger deal going forward, where maybe in the past, in the General Motors or something like that, unions served to have a collaborative relationship with the firm, and now it's really becoming more about holding on to jobs, and this ties back into this need for some systems of economic security, because what these workers want is not to be a front desk worker, they just want security. And if we can develop ways of protecting income or living standards without protecting particular jobs, I think that it would be a big step forward. I think states have a lot of capacity to experiment in this arena. The next thing is sort of the interstate mobility. So, one aspect of occupational licensing that people sometimes neglect. So it clearly is a taxing regulation at the local level, but it also affects interstate mobility quite dramatically. And I think there's an analogy here with some of the stuff going on around like Amazon's HQ2 and how states end up sort of being locked into a kind of a race to the bottom, and ultimately, through tax abatements and so forth, in forms of crony capitalism, sort of fissuring out any kind of revenue benefit that would come from an Amazon locating. And I think I can connect this with occupational licensing a little bit, because some of the most successful reforms to occupational licensing haven't been pure deregulation, but have been sort of interstate compacts. So there's one for nurses, one for medical professionals. And I think states going forward, because there's going to be a lot of disruption in services and places that have been sort of immune from disruption, need to start working together more and coordinating their efforts, and not letting the allure and the glamour of having Amazon or whomever locate in their state be incentive enough to defect and race to the bottom. So, I sort of don't want this to end up becoming a federal thing. For it to remain a state prerogative, states have to sort of step up and recognize that there are struggling regions across the country, and a lot of the times tax incentives that try to lure companies from one side of the border to another end up being very zero-sum. So sort of my concluding thought is, and this is related to work I'm going to be doing through 2019, is exploring the role of a kind of, I'm thinking of calling it like an office of struggling regions that would play a purely coordinating role. There's already things like this in the FTC and Department of Commerce that would bring together and help coordinate governors and city officials on working together and like actively colluding against sort of corporate interests that would try to make them fight off each other. And I think this applies both to firm location, site location, but also occupational regulation and safety net programs. So one thing that's never going to come from the state level is a safety net program for relocation assistance. No governor is going to approve of a program that pays for people to leave their state. But there's possibilities of that coming through a compact. So I think these are things that have been underexplored and are going to be way more relevant, because despite it being called the future of work, often the conversation is backward looking, and we talk about manufacturing skills mismatch and stuff like that, when the Alexa example at Marriott suggests that the real conversation is going to be this 70% of the economy that works in services and has, through sort of being untouched for so long, accumulated a lot of regulatory privileges.
Excellent, Greg.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Greg. I'm happy to represent Silicon Valley as I think the only guy here not wearing a collared shirt. Whenever these topics of the future of work come up, it is always mired in fear. Even on this panel today, all of the talk has been like, how can we just keep up with the change? And I don't understand where that fear comes from because it's not based in historical evidence. And so what my brief remarks want to show you is that the future of work is good, it's getting better, and states can take action, I think, to allow most people to have a better job market than their parents ever imagined. And that can continue on for every generation, at least in the foreseeable future. Since we started collecting job data from census in about the 1850s, the number of routine jobs has slowly declined, and the number of creative opportunities, high-paying wages has monotonically increased. No period in American history has ever seen sustained, non-high growth levels of creative, high-paying jobs. There was recently a Brookings Institute report by the economist David Artur, which found that, and this trend has continued over the last couple decades, that everywhere you see automation, automation creates more jobs than it destroys. And those jobs are high-paying, good, creative, interesting jobs. So why is that? Automation does one simple thing. It just takes something we know that is routine or we have found a pattern in and finds a way to replace human labor with machine labor. And what that has meant is that the things we can't predict very well end up being paid positions. No one ever thought in 1850 that millions of people were going to drive an automobile. Again and again and again, automation ends up creating job opportunities that are more complex than the jobs that disappear. I dug into the census data on job transitions. So if you look at things like manufacturing and other jobs that are disappearing, the ones that are being replaced in the service sector, healthcare, and others are not only require more education and more skills, but they're higher paying per hour. If you look at the total percentage of people who have lost their job to some type of displacement, the ones getting new jobs are retaining a higher percent of their income than they were in the 80s and the 90s for a lot of occupations, and they're having higher hourly wages. What is happening is that the one job per lifetime, one job at a time, that's declining. So if you look at gig workers, people working for Uber, Instacart, and others, a lot of them are doing side hustles. I like to talk to every single one of my Uber drivers, and I am fascinated by all of the things that they're doing on the side: photography, art, entrepreneurship. And we tend to think that this is some kind of exceptional artifact, that only a few people are doing it. But the number of people doing side hustles and the number of people having creative things on the side that supplement their income is increasing. And the thing that automation is doing is it's allowing a greater percent of the workforce to have at least a part-time job that not only pays a higher hourly wage than their current position, but allows them to do something that they love. Survey after survey after survey of people who are working in these flexible environments say that they wouldn't choose to go back to a W-2 employment. They like the flexibility of being able to work when they want and pursue other career opportunities. So one thing that I have been experimenting with is how states and cities can help people get into new employment through freelancing. Freelancing in many ways is far better than college or other vocational things because job experience is the best form of education. This is how it's done in my city. Everyone you talk to in Silicon Valley has a side hustle, and that often became a major source of income, if not their primary employment, sometime later. That's how a lot of people get into skilled occupations. As other parts of the economy begin to look like Silicon Valley and take on more innovation, that's just what it means to be a skilled worker. to have more than one thing, to pursue something that you love, and the opportunity to have multiple employments at the same time. The thing that prevents people from taking advantage of how automation creates more high-paying opportunities ends up being regulation and government, right? We attach benefits to a W-2 single employer job. It was the Affordable Care Act that allowed a lot of people to pursue a more entrepreneurial lifestyle and get away from the employer they didn't want and go into Uber or other things like Instacart, and then also pursue freelance opportunities, being an electrician or a nurse or a programmer, just like it is in my hometown of San Francisco. So I'll leave it at that, but I think, for 150 years, we've seen nothing but the growth of high-skill, high-paying jobs. That is continuing, unabated. And if we let regulation get out of the way and let the free market work and people pursue the opportunities that they're seeing right in front of them that they love, we're going to see a better labor market year after year.
Wow. Okay. We want to have a conversation with all of you. I'm going to kick the conversation off. If you have a question, flag me down. But I want to talk a little bit about something, Tim, you mentioned. Are there states, are there leaders on this? Because we heard a lot about the fear, a lot of fears that people have. The gig economy, is it going to make my income go down? I don't have the training. I'm going to lose my job that I have trained for, especially from mid-career folks. I think, again, on my home state of Minnesota, where we have a huge trucking industry. And I dared to speak about this earlier this year, and I think I had every labor union and trade person and trucking company call me within 24 hours to say, this is a disaster. Don't talk about this. We have to talk about this. This is going to happen. And so how do we talk about it, alleviate that fear, and are there state leaders that are headed in the right direction that we should look at?
Sure. So I don't want to pick favorites among our 55 state and territorial governors. I think there are two that I would point out who I think are leading the conversation among the governors. So the first is the chair of our organization this year is the governor of Montana, Steve Bullock. And every chair gets to pick an initiative, a topic to focus on, and his is around the future of work. It's called Real Jobs for All Americans, and he is leading this conversation among the governors of what's working out there, what isn't working, and how do we talk to our citizens? How do we have a conversation? How do we build robust modern economies? To your point, what's the role of government in the future economy? What's the role of the private sector? So he's really leading the conversation among the governors. And then the second one I would point out is the outgoing governor of Michigan, Governor Rick Snyder. He came into Michigan in 2010 in the midst of the recession, and he has put a real laser focus on the future Michigan economy. And rather than sort of fearing things like autonomous vehicles, he said, if we've got a great university system and we've got these amazing automobile manufacturers, let's lead on autonomous vehicles and let's make that the industry of the future for Michigan. So just two examples.
Excellent. And we talk a lot about mid-careers. Tim, I want to go back to something you led with, Aaron, about millennials ending up with a lot of college debt. How do we prepare them when they're being saddled already with so much debt to look at, you're probably going to have 2 or 3 careers in your lifetime. How do we prepare them for the transition that's coming?
Right. So first of all, that's a huge challenge because we have this complicating factor, which is tuition keeps rising.
Right.
So it's very likely debt's going to keep rising. And what makes it even more challenging is that there's a lot of research that indicates that because we keep allowing more and more debt to enter into the higher education system, that's actually contributing to the rise in tuition. So partly we have to completely rethink our model for how we're funding higher education. And by that I do not mean the state investing a ton per se. What I mean by that is we need to bring economic incentives back into that. Unfortunately, there's all sorts of barriers to colleges basically facing market forces, right? If when you're going into college, for example, most students have no clue what the average pay is going to be for the job and the major that they're thinking about. That is not published. We don't know. And in fact, that's actually a broader issue, which is just the lack of state-level data on so many things. Right? There's a reason that a lot of the best research right now on all these issues we've been talking about is using federal data, because for the most part, states don't open their books. And so I think if students knew, okay, if I go to this college and I do this major, I should expect on average to get a starting pay of this, then you're going to get better sorting of students into the right places. And then I would also say that post-graduation, we need to keep having that discussion about what to do with the student loan program as far as flexible repayment stuff. There's certainly benefits to having flexible repayment options, such as income-based stuff, but there are downsides as well. There's no free lunch, as they say. So I would say both on the funding side and the transparency side, and then the flexibility of the repayment side, those are the things to look at.
Sam, I want to talk briefly with you about
Do we get a comment on any of the topics if we disagree? No?
I'm sorry?
No? We're just going one by one?
He wants to fight.
Are we going to, I have a particular opinion about what he just said. Should
by
we
all
debate?
means, please.
I don't want to take up Sam's time because I dearly love Sam, but we can add a little spice to this, right? Okay, so the one thing I completely disagree is stop sending people to college to get jobs. Stop. It is, if you look at the entire history of college, it was never at any point in time ever designed to prepare people for work. That includes today when you ask college administrators and professors, do you think college is preparing people for work? And they say no, it shouldn't be, and it shouldn't be judged by that. The reason we started sending people to college was because in the 20th century, labor unions made a pact with CEOs who couldn't agree over how much to pay apprentices. So they saddled state-based education providers with training people. And no one at that time, when we made the transition to college, ever thought that job training would be better inside of a classroom. And then we've just followed that for 100 years. The best education for someone comes in the workplace. Get them working as fast as possible in any job that they want to do. And just start experimenting wildly with how you can do that. But the idea that we're going to send people into a classroom and they're just going to pray that after they've had tons of debt, then they're going to get a job, that hasn't been working. We should probably stop doing that.
So, and by the way, let me say, I don't disagree. I mean, as a faculty,
disagree with me.
What I'm saying is, I agree that college is not just a job training program. I mean, in fact, that incentive never comes down to the faculty. At no point does anyone ever, an administrator ever tell a faculty member, you'll get a promotion, you'll get more pay, you'll do this or that if the employment outcomes of your students improve. That being said, students have all sorts of motives for going to college, and it just seems to me that transparency is absolutely necessary because there's a whole bundle of things they gain from doing it.
In the interest of debate, I'm not sure I agree with what I'm about to say, but I want a reaction.
Excellent.
Because I hear your point, and I think, if all of us obviously went through some form of higher education, I'm assuming especially with two professors at the table, right, or former professors, there's a value to college, right? It may not be job training, but if we think we need to have, and I do agree with, we think we need to have lifelong learners. We think people are going to have to transition because we don't know what the job market's going to look like in 20 years, right? I have a brand new son. I have no idea what job opportunities will be afforded to him when he's 22 because I can't predict where the economy is going to go. Isn't there something to be said for the value of education to help reinforce the ability to be a lifelong learner? And do we not risk if we take someone 18 or 20 and train them in a job that they will end up lacking flexibility down the road? I'm not sure I agree with that, but I just...
My source of cynicism of this is especially at the state level, governors hear from a lot of different stakeholders talking about skill shortages and skills mismatch. And there's sometimes truth to those things, but I tend to heavily discount those things because always when you're doing your demand supply curve, there's a quantity and a price, and if you're not willing to pay for the workers, that's probably why you're not getting the workers. And so and in practice, when a lot of this continuing education stuff comes through, and I mentioned GAO has counted over 60 employment and training programs at the federal level, what ends up happening is you get shoved into a dingy room in a community college and you talk about continuing education. So I worry about how do you actually actualize and operationalize continuing education.
It's also important to note, I mentioned that the average return to education is rising. That doesn't necessarily imply the marginal return for everyone is higher. So there was a debate during several years ago about having free community college for everybody. Turns out that a lot of the most recent studies are showing that the students that are just on the margin between going to community college or not have extremely high dropout rates when they are pushed into it. So in terms of bang for the buck, in terms of public investment in anything, if you're going to go that route, it's not necessarily all that high to funnel something into getting enrollment if you're not then going to get attainment on the other end.
Free community college is a terrible idea.
It's a more succinct way of saying it, yeah.
I mean, it would be nice if we could there is empirical evidence on this. So there are countries that went just heavily funded and pushed almost everyone they could to go to college, to South Korea and Portugal. And you look at those economies, and the graduates are not happy. In South Korea, wages for college graduates dropped precipitously, 25%. So much so that the president of South Korea said, stop doing this. This is a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing it anymore. We can look to other places that have heavily funded, subsidized college for lots of people, and the results were not good.
With that, let's take some questions from the audience. Please, if you could, shout it out as loud as you can. You have a
Hello, hi. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you guys for being here. This is an amazing topic. I have so many notes jotted down right now. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit it to one, maybe two. So I think, Timothy, you mentioned something about brain drain and this idea that you have a lot of talent, or people in certain states have a lot of talent leaving to other states where there's job opportunities. And that's actually something I see a lot in Michigan. I'm originally from California, and so I had no idea what brain drain actually was until I moved to Michigan. And no offense. And I live right next to Michigan State University, and I didn't understand why this great university we're losing a lot of their talent to other states. So I started wondering if you or any of the other panelists have did any research with remote work. I'm very passionate about remote work. I think it's the great equalizer, if you want to say that. But I think remote work has the opportunity of keeping talent in your state, even if you don't necessarily have those job opportunities, because you'll live there and you'll spend your money in your economy. So has that ever been explored? And then my last question is in regard to this idea of lifelong learners. I'm as millennial as it gets, so the idea of staying at one workplace for 5 years makes me want to die. So I'm wondering though, if there seems to be a general consensus that we need to have lifelong learners, but there also seems to be a lot of opposition and the idea of job hopping, it still seems to have a very negative connotation. So obviously we cannot legislate companies to change their attitudes towards job hopping, but I'm wondering if there's any compelling research that suggests that if you stay at a place for a long time, you're actually not producing any more value. So I don't know if that's the question or not.
Thank you.
On the first question, I don't have any specific research around remote work and the brain drain. I think it's a growing topic of interest that I'm hearing about. I think we need to see more companies willing to, it kind of goes into your second question, right? Are companies going to be more willing to pursue long-term or permanent remote working opportunities? And then that kind of gets into sort of a connectivity issue and access to technology, because if you're in an area, if you're going to be a long-term remote worker, you've got to make sure you can do that remote work. So, but I think it's an interesting topic to explore more, in particular where Michigan's kind of, I think, always held up as one of the big examples where Michigan and Michigan State graduates graduate and then immediately decamp somewhere else. So I'm curious if any other panelists have thoughts on it or work on it.
Yeah, I want to push back on that a little bit, because actually there was a recent study done out of the University of Wisconsin, and they look at basically whether this is true on average. Are people getting educated at the university in their state and then leaving? Which, if true, would be a total waste of money. Why would you funnel anything into that? And actually the study found that that's for the most part not the case. It's actually, most people are sticking around. It's certainly going to be very different based on the type of institution. So at Missouri, where I'm a faculty member, University of Missouri students are likely to stay in Missouri. People who go to WashU, elite private place that come from all over the country, of course they're not going to stay in Missouri, they're going to go anywhere. And then with regard to the other thing, not to be too grim, but there's this saying that says, great ideas advance one funeral at a time, meaning that, think about funerals as businesses instead of people dying. As new companies are coming on the scene, cultures are going to change. So it's something where I think we can be optimistic. We don't have to be completely pessimistic about stale corporate culture. I think that's likely to evolve.
One of the growing areas of work in the modern economy is care work, right? And one area that I work on a lot is childcare, child poverty policy, stuff like that. And so I think remote work intersects with this a little bit. So I guarantee you the next time there's a Democratic Congress, national daycare program is going to be one of their top priorities. And they're basically going to try to federalize, universal pre-K, something like that. And I think they're doing it at the most perplexing time because remote work is becoming more and more a thing. So like the vice president of the Niskanen Center we're in DC, but he works out of Iowa, and he lives in his attic and has a computer, and he's raising his kid. And that's going to be more and more the reality. Telecommuting was forecasted in as early as the mid-90s, but some of the stuff just required technology to really iron out the wrinkles. And there's a recent article in Vox which was praising the DC's universal daycare program, and they buried the lead because DC spends about $17,000 per kid in pre-K. I was like, well, would a minimum wage worker prefer $17,000 in cash or the pre-K option, especially if they're if they do have a job where they get to work from home. So I think those are things to, there's risks in all these proposals in sort of locking in a particular market structure and building institutions around sort of a model of work that is becoming less common.
I think remote work is fantastic. There was this, there's an education company, Treehouse, which profiled this woman who was this mother of twins in Iowa. And while she was raising her kids, and I think had another full-time job, she learned how to be a programmer doing freelance remote work. And now she has a wonderful way to provide for her family. These types of flexible arrangements are great. The way in which cities and states get in the way is that, so let's take unemployment. If you want to continue getting unemployment benefits, you have to look for a W-2 job. If you pursued this particular mother's career path, you wouldn't be considered eligible for those unemployment benefits because the state would say that you're not looking for a real job. Right, so that's one way in which people are wanting these opportunities, but cities and states incentivize the old model of working. And as far as the other question was about relocation. Great, if that's what the market wants, let that happen. In California, we kind of had a regulation against regulation, which was non-competes. California didn't recognize non-competes, and that's one of the ways Silicon Valley developed, is that people job hop all the time, and they could go from industry to competitor, and it spread knowledge. So at least in high-skilled industries where I come from, job hopping is fantastic. It spreads knowledge. Concurrent.
One more question. There was someone over here. Wow, we stunned him into silence. Okay, this gentleman right here.
I was just with respect to sort of rewinding with regard to the value of college as preparatory for actual job training. How do you do that when it's become so fixed as a heuristic for valuing a potential employee's contribution to a company? How essentially do you get the horse back into the barn after so many companies have come to look at college as a fundamental prerequisite?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that's contributing to it, a low unemployment rate. Extremely low unemployment is causing employers to essentially push back against this degree inflation because they have no choice. There was in St. Louis, for example, there was basically a program that tried to connect basically ex-cons to jobs. And for years, the person running that would get no callbacks. And now that person's phone is ringing all the time. And so that's not a permanent solution. Of course, the labor market's going to go through ups and downs, and unemployment's going to rise, and there's always that risk that we go back to that. But at least for the time being, as long as the market's staying strong, that can push back against it.
And we've seen the same thing happening in actual state government hiring, in particular around IT and technical jobs, because either there is a skills mismatch or they cannot afford the talent that exists. So where they're able to, going back and looking at the job postings and saying, did we just throw a college degree required in here 20 years ago when we wrote it and never look at it again? So that's obviously a symptom of the overall labor market, but also in individual states. And I think having some government agencies maybe begin to change those attitudes starts to help the conversation. Obviously, it has to happen broader than that.
And also having state government recognize the fact that they might have to share an employee with a private employer because there is a benefit to having that outside expertise, and maybe we don't need to have as our state does, the largest employer in our state is our state government. And as those baby boom employees start to retire, it's caused a real burden on state and local government to start to rethink, what should our workforce look like? Where can we attract the best talent we still need, especially the in-demand jobs in IT and other things like that, where we've had just absolute cataclysmic failures because so many of the best and the brightest have left and gone to where their opportunities are greater in private employment. And state government finally realizing we have to maybe share, maybe we have to rethink all of this.
So I like that question because it comes to possibly the easiest solution I can think of in public policy. Just stop. Google has stopped hiring on college degrees. Governments could do the same. They said, we're not going to recognize it. We don't care whatever you put. You go to Harvard, you go to Stanford, you go to community colleges, we're just not going to recognize it. And if all state governments did that, it just would stop mattering. And it's really easy because you can just unilaterally do it. You don't need legislation, you don't need it. You just say to the HR managers, stop.
It's not that easy in every state.
With that,
what barriers are there?
In some states, I shouldn't say some states, I know in 2 states we worked with on cybersecurity job postings, which is where this conversation started. The job postings are part of negotiated labor agreements that go back for a very long time. So changing those job postings,
Do those negotiated labor agreements require some sort of degree?
It's all part of the job posting. So that job has a classification and has requirements that go to it. So the governor or whomever could come out in the agency head and say, we don't care about college, but the individual job posting still has a requirement. So I'm just saying,
how do we get rid of that?
That's why I'm saying it's not as easy, I think, as you posit. In the private sector, it is. In some states, I'm sure it is as easy as you posit. I'm just pointing.
Does it need
pointing
like legislation or something?
No, I guess it would probably need a new bargaining agreement.
right.
Okay, I learned something.
Yeah. One last question.
Good morning, thank you. I just actually wanted to build upon this last comment. So thinking about, we've had the discussion of where we want to go, where it's going to lead, but what are some actual tangible steps that state governments could do right now? Are there any low-lying fruit? We recently saw the governor of New Mexico have a big executive order against or reducing a lot of the occupational licensing requirements. I mean, I think that stands in the way of allowing people to jump back and forth from freelancing or side hustles, whatever. Are there any, aside from maybe renegotiating labor agreements, are there other tangible things that folks back in the States can do right now, and what's stopping them from doing it?
I can start with a couple things not to do. Okay, so for example, ban the box, don't do it. Attempts to ban employers from checking credit records, don't do it. Both of those things, you can make a compelling story that the average person will find reasonable, but they blow back. Right? They basically hurt employment opportunities for people at the lower end. You can also talk about the very hot potato of $15 minimum wage. I would suggest that that's not a good way to go. And then the other thing is, for any of these things, we need more data. It sounds very technocratic and not very inspiring, but the reality is making policy in the dark probably isn't the best way to go. So we need to have states open their books so that people can, so that the public and researchers and everybody can see what's going on.
The data piece is huge. We have a project that just kicked off around data in states in the gig economy. Because what the governors are saying is, you keep telling us about the quote-unquote gig economy, but we have no idea how many people are employed in our state. How big is that? It's all anecdotal. Unless you look at sort of the national. So the data is the big piece. And the second one I would just say, the governors are good on this topic, many of them are, but let's just not all fall back into each other's corners and yell at each other. We recognize the scope of this problem requires listening to maybe people we disagree with initially and testing new ideas. And so part of that goes back to Annette's opening comments, letting the states be the laboratories of democracy and try, and some things may fail and programs may fail, but let's try, let's learn from each other and share the experience.
And just one last point. In addition to just like outright repealing certain occupational licenses, there are other ways of liberalizing the market a little bit. There's mutual recognition of other state licenses. There's precedent of doing expedited licenses from out of state. And so any amount of like competition you get from other states, you can sort of try to make the common denominator be the more liberal version of those occupational categories?
I can give you a couple. One, so the state of Colorado is trying to implement a private sector partnership with apprenticeships. So states can do convenings by getting employers to start hiring apprentices. The second thing is you can pair those apprenticeship programs with community colleges and require community colleges to accept apprentices and college credit within the degree requirement. The third is that you can do matched earned income tax credits. So if you pair work with an expanded wage subsidy, this has some pro-employment benefits, and you can experiment with that. New York did it in a program called Paycheck Plus, and there's some preliminary evidence that it works well. You can allow unemployment benefits to go with gig workers and the self-employed. Number 5, you could try a fund of funds. Utah and Ohio has been doing a place where they match private sector investment in venture capital, and that tends to create more jobs in some sectors. So that's another thing you can experiment with. Third, you could allow accreditation to go to non-traditional education providers like Udacity, Treehouse, and other boot camps in your area. Then students could, instead of going to a community college, they could go to these more vocational-oriented ones. So I think that's 6. And I would say that no one. The best thing you could do with these or a dozen others is just experiment wildly and share the information. The things that people do in these cities is when they try different things, they don't do it in a way that's scientific, and as a result, we don't know if it works or not. So get together with your employers, try out these 6, or allow them to try another dozen. Do it in a randomized fashion, report the results, and then share.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't thank Aaron, Tim, Sam, Greg, thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting questions. I think we have our charge here today, so we need more data from the states. And those of us who are here from state-based think tanks have a lot of work to do in encouraging what will happen and being part of the solution rather than, I think you said it best, going into our corners and huddling with fear about the future. The future's here, and it's time that we embrace it and start to promote it. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you all for your attention. We'll have a brief break and then come back with the next panel. Thank you so much.